locked in. Lance, thanks so much for hanging out with us today.
Sure, good to be here.
So it was a year ago yesterday that C.J. Stroud, DeMeco Ryans won their first game with the Texans, and I feel like kind of announced themselves as being a potentially good team as the Texans throttled the Jaguars here in Jacksonville. What are your memories from that day?
Well, they had come off of a game where we didn't know what to expect from C.J. Stroud. They had played the Ravens, which was a tough first game out, and it was C.J. Stroud was not the C.J. Stroud that people think of him now. So it was really quite a surprise, to be honest with you. I know Houston's had their issues with Jacksonville over the years. It's been a lot of give and take over the years, frankly. But I just thought, okay, this is going to be tough for them to win this one going in. And you got Steelers coming up. That'll probably be a loss. And so that was quite a surprise that the Texans played as well as they did offensively in Jacksonville last year. And it really kick-started what became a very surprising season and then a growing narrative surrounding the Houston team in terms of being a team to watch in the AFC. It's kind of grown over time.
Lance, let's take a look at last week. The Texans coming off a loss to the Vikings. The Vikings defense is kind of the talk of the town right now. But tell us a little bit about Houston's offense last week. It seems like maybe some of those, the deep threat passes that were happening last year aren't happening as much, those explosive plays. But tell us a little bit about some of the woes you saw last week and maybe some of the positives coming out of Houston's offense early this year.
Yeah, I think the league-wide trend is to play two deep safeties now, more shell coverages, which is specifically geared to taking away explosive plays and forcing a lot of these young quarterbacks to prove that they can sustain drives. And, Minnesota did a lot of that as well, but they also really challenged Houston's front from a pass rush standpoint. I think the Texans, C.J. Stroud, Bob Slowick, the play caller, they're going to have to figure out how to move the ball consistently on the ground. They did that in the first game against the Colts, but they haven't had, but then the next game you had you didn't have Joe Mixon, and then game 3 you didn't have Joe Mixon. And so the Texans right now have been without their ground game that they saw in game 1, which made it a lot easier to move the ball. Last year they didn't have much of a ground game. They still were able to be explosive offensively. But as I mentioned, league-wide, there's a trend now to take away explosive plays. And the only way you counter that is to take what they give you, which is a lot of intermediate throws, the short catch and run type throws. So I think what you're going to see is the Texans really get back to utilizing Tank Dell this week against the Jaguars. I think you'll still see the catches and targets for Stephon Diggs as well. But really, Houston has to figure out how to really maximize the short and intermediate passing game, because I think a lot of the play action deep balls that they were getting before, they're not going to see because so many teams are playing zone against them now.
You can find him on X at Lance Zierlein. That's Zierlein. He is, of course, not only a radio host in Houston, but also a part of NFL media at NFL.com, joining us on the Garber Auto Mall hotline. Lance, let's stay on the offensive side of the ball for the Texans. That offensive line, we mentioned this in the opening segment of our program today. It's an offensive line that was certainly banged up last year, the most of any outfit in the National Football League, and yet it found success. 12 penalties last week, 11, I believe, the week prior. Can you put a finger exactly? Not only those penalties are obviously on the whole team, not just the offensive line, but the majority of them came at the line of scrimmage. Can you put a finger on some of the struggles for this offensive line early on in this season?
Well, yeah. I mean, Houston last week got clipped by the same thing that we saw in the first game of the year, which with Ronnie Stanley and the Ravens, which was the emphasis on lining up the tackles where the center's waist is. You've got to have your helmet there. So really, the Texans got clipped with that 3 different times. You had Laramie Tunsil lining up actually twice it was Laramie Tunsil. The other time, I think it may have been the right tackle, where they were not lined up properly. So the league has made a point of emphasis. They called 3 penalties there, and then you had multiple false starts. Laramie Tunsil is the worst, the left tackle for the Texans. He is the worst at jumping quickly to try to get the jump on pass rushers. It just doesn't seem to care about correcting it. So this has been an issue now for going on 4 years. So he got 2 or 3 more in that regard. He had 6 penalties all told, only 5 that were accepted. And you had false starts along the interior too. So the Texans, number one, had a problem with consistently blocking the rush for Minnesota. But then the other problem was they just kept tacking on 5-yard penalties left and right with pre-snap penalties and misaligned tackles. And so, when you're already in a tough situation against a defense coordinator that seems to have the number of that type of offense, he did it the week before against San Francisco. Brian Flores did it against the Texans. It's the same coaching tree. The offensive play calling comes off the same Shanahan tree. You can't afford to continue to have 5-yard penalties. You can't afford to have penalties that move you back where you're constantly playing behind the sticks. And that's what happened. But it was a butt kicking. I mean, it wasn't like, the penalties. The Minnesota Vikings humbled the Texans on both sides of the ball, the coaching staff, and it may have been the best thing for the Texans because the hype train was getting a little out of control, and this is a reminder that, hey, you're not there yet.
Yeah, both teams coming off of butt kickings, that's for sure, Lance. What's the latest with Joe Mixon and Dameon Pierce, the backs for the Texans?
Mixon's got a shot to play. Dameon Pierce, we're going to wait and see. We should know more by tomorrow if they participate. I think my guess is you'll see Mixon back along with Cam Akers, and I'm not sure you'll see Cam as his backup. I'm not sure you'll see Dameon Pierce this week, but we'll find out. I mean, Pierce is a hammerhead runner. He's not as dynamic, but the Texans will take anything they can get because they have to get the run going. Although, after the way Jacksonville played the pass last week, I'm sure they're not going to shy away from throwing the ball.
Yeah, I was about to say we have a long list of things that we got to work on here, Lance, and passing game being one of those. But I did want to talk about some of the younger pieces. For example, Kamari Lassiter, who's been playing really well from what I've seen so far this season. Tell us a little bit about him and what the secondaries looked like so far this year.
Yeah, the secondary is exploitable. Kamari has played pretty well up to this point. Rookie who's very hard-nosed, very aggressive. He's a D'Amico Ryans type of player where he's just all about football. He'll come up and hit you and run support. He's a sticky cover man, but if you've got some speed matched against him, you can get some deep separation. So he's somebody who's much better over the first and second level than once the play, heads deep. Still waiting for Stingley. Stingley is not off to the same start he was the year before, but the Texans also, I think, are better suited for him when he's getting to play man-to-man. So, Derek Stingley's still, a top cover corner. That's not a problem. Where you get into the issue for the Texans, I think, is Jalen Petrie is their nickel. He's really more of a safety, but he's playing the nickel, so your slot receivers, the ones with speed, will have an advantage over number 5, Jalen Petrie. And then from a safety standpoint, I think they're very average. Jimmy Ward has his limitations in coverage, and Eric Murray is solid but, upgradable. So I think, there are on paper, Jacksonville should be able to attack the secondary, but once again, we really haven't seen that consistently. But on paper, there is the potential to not only throw the ball in certain matchups, but also, I think, run the ball between the tackles a little bit.
Lance Zierlein is our guest on the Garber Auto Mall hotline. Lance, who do you believe is X factor, priority number one, when you look at the scouting report, big picture for the Houston Texans? Who are they most concerned about on the Jacksonville Jaguars roster?
Well, I think probably Etienne and Josh Allen. I mean, you've got one guy that can rush off the edge and you can move him around to either side. So keeping the quarterback safe, because when you have a guy who can get off the edge and rush, it leads to false starts for the Texans. So it's kind of a dual concern there. But then on top of that, you also have the concern of Etienne getting going. And he's somebody that can beat you out of the backfield. He's somebody that can get the running game going. And, once you get the running game going, you start to eat up time of possession, keep the Texans offense off the field. And so I think that's always a concern, is having a team that runs the ball well against you, especially with a dynamic running back like Etienne, who can beat you in a couple different ways. So, and, it wouldn't shock me to see after last week, Jacksonville start leaning more heavily on that facet of the offense.
All right, Lance, so we really appreciate your time today, and hope you have a good time watching this game in Houston.
We'll see how it goes. Both teams need to bounce back, that's for sure.
Yeah, one needs a win. That's the bottom line.
That's the difference.
Thank you, Lance.
All right, thanks, guys.
All right, there he goes, Lance Zierlein, host of John and Lance on 97.5 and 92.5 in Houston.
Hey, Mia here, and thanks so much for watching 1010XL Jaguars. For even more coverage of the Big Cats, be sure to subscribe to 1010XL Jaguars.